Welcome to the Digital Portrait Drawing class. We are now in lesson 13, and in this lesson we are going to push our skills a step further and take one of the previous portraits that we've created and turn it into a color illustration. Okay, so let's begin with the file from lesson number 11, which was the 3/4 view portrait. I've got that open and it's also available in the class files. I'm going to throw away both the head reference and the guide marks because we're not going to need those, and also the merged layers that are on top and below the grouped layers. Throw those away as well. And I'm going to flatten that pencil group. So press Control or Command E and that'll merge it, and I'll just rename this as pencil drawing. Alright, now I'm going to change the mode of that to multiply. You don't really see a difference right now, but you will as we begin drawing the color in underneath it. Now normally if you are doing a drawing to be inked or colored in later, you wouldn't normally put as much shading in as what we did here, but it still works with this technique. And I also need to mention that the technique I'm going to show you is not the ultimate final technique for coloring or inking a drawing. It's just happens to be one that I think works well for beginners to learn the craft. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is create a new layer for my color palette. And what this is going to hold is essentially just little swatches of color that I can easily sample from while I'm doing the coloring. Now I know Photoshop has a color swatch panel that you could do pretty much the same thing with. It's just not my preference. Now we are not going to be using the pencils while we're doing this. We are going to use a standard brush. Well, we'll start with a standard brush, a hard round brush. And I'm going to open the brush panel and move that spacing down lower than the default 25 so you create nice smooth lines. And I'm also going to make it more of an oval tip and slant it just a little bit because once again that just feels a little more natural to me than the perfectly round was. And I'm also going to increase the opacity all the way up for this and increase the size up to about 50. Okay, now with all that done, I am going to just create several colors to use as the skin tone. Okay, so what I've done here is created 5 different colors to use as skin tones, ranging from a very pale skin tone color to a very darker skin tone color to one that's more saturated. And by having these chips here, I find it really convenient to just hold down the Alt or the Option key, and the cursor becomes that eyedropper, so I can just click on each of these, and that's how I can select my color. Okay, so to begin, let's add a new layer for the skin base, and then I'm going to select not my lightest skin color, but the one just above that, and just go and start blocking in the skin. Now I'm not coloring everything in, I'm just coloring in where I know this base layer will be visible with some healthy overlap with the shaded areas that I know is going to use some of the darker color. Okay, then I'm going to create another layer for the second tone, and on that layer we'll use this darker tone here and start blocking in where some of that shadow is going to be. Alright, so what we've done is we've filled in all the basic shadow areas using this second tone here. Alright, and then from there we're going to add that darker tone where we will grab this deeply saturated one over here and start filling in those deep shadow areas. Okay, I notice at this point that I did neglect to fill in the neck area with that mid-tone, so I'm going to go back and take care of that now. Okay, then I want to add a highlight area or skin light, and really the place that I'm most concerned with adding that is right between the eyes here on the forehead. There should be a really bright, almost triangular shape in here. But we've also got it along the tip of the nose and then on some of those ridges in the ears as well. Now you'll notice at this point that I'm not trying to touch either the eyes, the hair, or the lips. Those will all come later on. Now layering in the different skin tones this way, or the different tones of really any surface in a colored illustration, is pretty standard. This is a pretty common workflow. It's what comes next that you'll find varies from artist to artist. And what I'm going to show you is almost a two-pronged technique for blending these colors together. First thing I'm going to do is start with that secondary skin tone, and then I'm going to grab my eraser tool, pull that up, make sure that the eraser is set to a standard width so that it's not doing the pen pressure on the width, or if it is set to pen pressure, set that minimum diameter up nice and high to about 50 or 60%. Alright, I've got the opacity as well set to about 30 for this, because the whole idea here is now with this eraser, I'm going to go in and begin erasing the edges of that midtone. Now I'm going to go through and do this on both the midtone and on the highlight areas. Okay, so we're seeing a much better blend between the different tones there, just simply by using that eraser tool to sort of soften that edge and create a better transitional area between the two different colors. But the tone isn't exactly continuous. There is still sort of an abrupt change, and depending on the style you're going for, you may want that. I don't particularly care for that, at least in this effort. So what I'm going to do is yet another technique for blending those. I'm going to create what I call a blend layer. And then I'm going to grab my brush tool again, and this time I'm going to set the opacity down to about 50. And in this effort, what I'll do is use the Alt or Option key to sample one of those transitional edges and softly paint in some of those transitional colors. This will create a much better and smoother gradation between the two. Okay, so we've got some nice blends going on there. And now what I'm going to do is create what I call a fill layer. And this just becomes a catch-all layer that when I see little holes in the paintings, I can go in and just sample and fill those on the fill layer. So now we've got some good skin tones going on. Let's move on to some of the other elements. But first, I'm going to group all of the skin layers together and then start working on the lips. Now, I'm going to use essentially the exact same technique. So I'm going to pause the recording, go ahead and render the lips, and then turn it back on again afterwards. Okay, so here we are back with a fully painted set of lips. So I've got my lips group here, and just to show you exactly what happened, I drew in the lips base with a regular muted pink color, added a lips dark with the darker color, and then the lights, painted those in with clearly the lighter color. Now let's move on and do a very similar thing for the eyes. Okay, for the eyes, I actually opted to use just a single layer for the painting. I'll turn off the pencil drawing layer, and you can see exactly how that worked. There's the darker green on the outside, the mid-tone green just slightly surrounding the highlighted area, and then the lighter green on that lightest part of the iris, which is opposite the main highlight of the eye. So now he's got some nice bright piercing green eyes for us. So now turning our attention to the hair, I've updated the color palette layer to include a lighter blue, a very deep, almost navy blue, and then a near black. Now, why did I select a blue for this? Because with black hair, if there's a shine to it, a lot of times the shine will tend to have a bluish tint. And it's not necessarily that the hair is blue, it's just that that blue gives the same impression of darkness that the black can from time to time. So let's go ahead and add a base hair layer. So I'm just going to go ahead and add in the layers and block in the hair color just the same way I did for the skin. Okay, now I realize that seems like it was an extreme jump from having no hair to this nicely shaded hair, but it's really not as bad as you think. I'm turning off the mid and the light layer for a moment, and just so you can see what the hair base looks like. In fact, if I turn off the pencil drawing layer, you can see exactly what that hair base is like. It's just the standard mid-tone color with the dark color back around the ears. Now the hair mids, I did realize while I was painting it that I needed a more desaturated mid-tone color to catch some of the highlighting just right, so I elected to use a gray for that, and then I added the highlights according to the locks that I could see in the base pencil drawing. So when we add that all up and that pencil drawing is on top of it, it creates a really nicely textured head of hair. One of the main problems that I see now, though, is that the hair is not casting enough of a shadow on the head. We need to go back into the skin layer and add a hair shadow. And for that shadow, I will again use that deep, dark, saturated color that we've got in the skin palette. Okay, there we go. That tends to ground that hair down onto the scalp a lot better than it looked before. Now we begin with some of the fun digital effects that I think really make coloring in Photoshop that much more enjoyable. Let's start with the skin layer. Go ahead and create a merge layer from that. Now I'm going to control click on that layer so that I have a selection created of just that skin layer. And then I'm going to run that always popular Gaussian blur. You get a really nice transitional shading effect on the drawing with that. And now here's a neat trick. If you like the shading that you got with the original Gaussian blur, that's fine. If you want to try to see what it's like to dial it up a little more, that can just be done easily through the last filter that was run appears at the top of the filter menu, which is also Control F or Command F on a Mac. So you can just hit that hotkey a number of times until you get a level of blur that you really like. And then when you're ready, just go ahead and cancel that selection with Control or Command D. Now we've got a beautifully shaded skin on the facial area. So let's go to our next little trick, and that has to do with the hair. So if we look in really close at this hair base layer, you can tell the hair was colored in on that basic color with a brush that was probably too thick and probably done too quickly. Not a lot of care was used. I'm going to say that's intentional because I wanted to show you this technique involving the smudge tool. Now if we grab the smudge tool, make sure that you're using a small hard-edged round brush, and we move the strength of the smudge tool down just underneath 100, so somewhere in the 90s should work out pretty well for us. And then this does a really good job of pulling out individual hairs. So you can create some good textured hair fringes or edges with this smudge tool. And it works the same way going in too. If some of those inside parts don't quite look natural, you can pull either the hair color out or push the background color in. And you can continue on around to do that across the entire head. And if you care to, you can even do it with some of the other shading layers of the hair. Let's move up and create a gradient layer just underneath the pencil layer. And then let's change to a white paint color. Grab the gradient tool and use the foreground to transparent gradient on a radial form. And now I'm going to just create a couple of really small gradients, one for above the brow, one for along the cheek, and then a smaller one for over the nose. Too big. Smaller one for over the nose. All right, now these are just going to act as highlights, but right now they're too strong. Let's dial down that opacity to just about 60 or so. Still doesn't quite look right, so let's grab our eraser tool and begin carving out some of the areas that are going to need to not be highlighted. Okay, so that gives it a lot more depth and form to it because we've got some additional shading going on in there. Now I'm going to add a new layer on top of the pencil drawing, and I'm going to call this backlight. And with this one, I'm going to use a very large and soft brush, not an eraser. All right, and I'm going to choose a sort of deep bluish color. Just gently paint in along this back rim of the drawing. So along his back neck there, along the jaw some, and along the ears. Maybe a little bit here on the hair too. Now if there's spillover, just go ahead and grab your eraser tool, remove some of the spill, and that's far too bright, so let's change it to screen and pull the opacity way down. And what that does is just adds a little bit of a color lighting coming in from the back that can be seen on this back edge of the figure. Okay, next let's add a face blush layer. Now the whole point of this layer, using again a very soft and very large brush, is to add some color into his cheeks and other areas of his face. So I'm going to grab a reddish hue, and the point is that the face is not a uniform color all throughout it. There's certain elements of the face where the skin is closer to the blood vessels, and that creates a more blushed or reddish effect. And that does tend to happen like in the cheek area, around the eyes, tip of the nose, and a little bit down underneath the chin where it meets the neck. All right, I'm going to turn that to multiply and pull the opacity way down. Okay, now that's really looking pretty good. I think all we need to do at this point is add a gradient in behind it, and there we have our fully colored digital illustration, created entirely from a pencil-drawn portrait here in Photoshop. Alright guys, that's it for lesson 13. You did it. I realized that was a long one. There was a lot of steps. It was an involved process, but I hope you would agree that that was really quite worth it, where we took a previous portrait pencil drawing and turned it into a fully colored illustration, all here in Photoshop. Good job, folks. Now be sure to catch next lesson, number 14, where I will show you how to create a more stylized portrait.